Welcome to Philosophy of Value Workshops number 10 of Series 6. The question this evening is, what is the role of cognitive frameworks in the pursuit of value and the will to value? The reading, for those who want it, is from my work, The Pursuit of Value, Chapter 7, Section 8. So this is the last of 10 workshops in which I review my position on value, the will to value, and a sufficiency of value. I began this series by presenting 3 workshops on consciousness as a foundation of value. I then outlined 3 expressions of value in meaning or purpose, religion, and ethics. This was followed by explanations of both value and the principle of the will to value. Yet paradoxically, the concept of and different concepts of value are often overlooked. Conversely, the ideas and theories that prompt interest and excitement are sought as ends in themselves. I previously explained this syndrome in a number of ways. 2 of them are: 1, the neglect of value, and 2, mistaking subjective values as objective, illustrated as I've done in Sartre's Spirit of Seriousness. Today, I want to examine different kinds of such cognitive frameworks and their relations to consciousness and value. I have previously presented religion as a paradigm cognitive framework that supports value states. Other cognitive frameworks have also been noted, but they aren't usually thought of as such. These include ethics, truth, other people, and even attenuated cognition. Yet in order to illustrate the significance of this outlook, we need to outline its background of ideas. These include externalism, phenomenology, intentionality, and an error theory of consciousness. Analytic philosophy is also very interested in cognition, but with a very different perspective to phenomenology. The analytic view sees cognition in terms of epistemology, knowledge, logic, and reasons for action. Phenomenology regards cognition in terms of structure in intentional relations with mental objects. An existentialist expression of this idea is seen in Husserl's life world and in Heidegger's being in the world. Analytic interest in cognition is particularly pronounced in the cognitive non-cognitive debate. The debate is too extensive and complex to be summarized here, but we can identify it with Kant and Hume. Kant was a cognitivist, that moral values could be established by reason on a conception of things. Hume believed in the priority of feeling and held that reason is and ought only to be the slave of the passions. But phenomenological interest in cognition is very different. It is about cognition as objects of intentionality and the quality of both these objects and their intent. But Kant and Hume have more than just negative significance in this study. Kant's Copernican revolution, that perception is creative rather than passive, is seminal to phenomenology. And Hume emphasized the passions or feeling as well as the significance of value. Beginning with externalism, support for this view can be found in phenomenology. That is, in the phenomenological ideas of intentionality, and that consciousness is conscious of something. These are illustrated in the above Heidegger's anti-Cartesian concept of being in the world. An externalist theory of mind emphasizes the importance of external world in explanations of mind. That is, experience of the world, its objects, and our cognition of them are crucial to conscious existence. For example, minds without diversity, or brains in a vat, could not be conscious. This is a criticism of the idea of the brain as the sole or overriding precondition of consciousness. Sean Gallagher and Rom Harry cite a neurological fallacy of overemphasizing the role of the brain. Alveno presents an externalist view of the mind as a relation between a neurological center and an external world. Also in Max Wellman's consciousness similarly results from a relation with the world. The point is that externalism emphasizes the importance of cognitive perception of the world. To illustrate the relation, we can use Georges Bataille's metaphor of mind as water in a bottle or as liquid in a vessel. Here, the walls of the vessel are the cognitive frameworks which support and shape the mental liquid. Our issues are the independence of the value states and the degree of cognitive support they require. In the language of the metaphor, the liquid in the container can represent mental states of different viscosities. The thicker the liquid or mental state, the more independent it is of external structure. Water will flow all over the place. Hardened cement doesn't need an external structure at all. Sufficiencies of value will always be somewhere between these extremes. Sufficiencies like moral fortitude, resilience, maturity, self-esteem, and courage. There are several implications of this kind of relation between value states and their external objects. One, there is the implication of an externalist theory of mind. Two, it implies structure, and a particular structure of intentionality towards external cognitive objects. And three, there is also an implication of the dependency of value states on external cognitive objects. This relation between value states and cognitive frameworks is not only complex but progressive. That is, the development of both consciousness and value calls for decreasing levels of cognitive support. But as previously noted, human finitude means that sufficiencies of value are always insufficient. Human beings aren't absolute spirits with sufficient value able to confront every contingency. Self-concept, social esteem, and other people's regard are huge parts of a supporting cognitive framework. My usual example is of a 5-year-old who needs parental approval not required by a 25-year-old. Yet both the examples of a child and of religion show how we are dealing with a process of development. And in that development, we can see a preference for independence and a sufficiency of value. Yet value sufficiency is driven by the principle of value seeking further value to value as the will to value. In this dialectic, value seeks independence from cognitive support, which produces further value. And this value again needs support, which again seeks further more independent value. This is the dialectic between the relative sufficiency of value states and supporting cognitive frameworks. Yet the relative sufficiency of value is a sufficiency expressed in such ways as moral fortitude and self-esteem. And this way, the theoretical principle of the will to value is also a principle in life and in life experience. This view of cognition offers a different way of looking at disparate phenomena like truth and other people. That is, truth and other people can be viewed together as different, but as different kinds of conceptions. Other people are, of course, the salient reality behind a conception of them, but that conception of them is sustained by the truth of that reality. Other people have great import both as individuals and in groups, such as in politics, religion and other institutions. And social forces can be so overwhelming in such cases as sport, war or family allegiances. Social forces can be so strong that we may wonder if people really make up their own minds. For example, Spinoza held a social theory that motivation and desire were driven by other people. And such forces, such social forces, are always a bane to the individualist. Social force is evident in that we are continually involved with and need other people reinforcing their significance. And other people are also the only instances of intrinsic value that we can find in our world. An example of the significance of other people can be found in Ryan Brown's book, Honor Bound. Here, Brown differentiates between dignity cultures and honor cultures. Dignity cultures derive value from our humanity. Honor cultures derive value from reputation. For example, an award is an honor that would be undermined if everyone was awarded that honor. And we might have an intuitive preference for dignity cultures over honor cultures. A more ethically explicit account of the significance of social esteem is given by Philip Pettit, my ex-supervisor. Pettit, with Geoffrey Brennan, construct a theory of ethics on a maximization of personal interests. They write that people desire the esteem of others and shrink from their disesteem. And then they go on to associate their view with an intellectual tradition that includes Adam Smith, Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, the Baron de Montesquieu and David Hume. And they say just about everyone who is a forebear of modern social and political theory. Pettit demonstrates the importance of both self-esteem and social esteem. But I have several criticisms of his account that further my general thesis. One, social esteem produces a moral order that may not be moral, for example, in the cases of Vikings and Nazis. Two, social esteem is a powerful but contingent factor that I argue should be replaced by self-esteem. And three, both social and self-esteem presuppose an underlying principle of motivation. And I propose that the underlying principle of motivation is that of value and a will to value. Ryan Brown and Philip Pettit explain both a justifiable and not so justifiable conception of other people. Sartre's repudiation of a spirit of seriousness makes the same point in relation to conceptions of objects. The spirit of seriousness is to take subjective values as objective, to avoid freedom and responsibility. The seriousness is to say that certain values are objective and therefore we have no choice. But Sartre regards this as inauthentic, bad faith, and hiding behind the idea of objectivity. Taking the idea of inauthentic cognitive frameworks further, Sartre speaks of refraining from, he says, appropriating things for their own sake, and try to realize the symbolic appropriation of being in itself. For Sartre, the issue here is not accepting that objects represent freedom and the pursuit of being, and that their supposedly objective status is inauthentic and self-indulgent support. In my analysis, I have added the simple step of regarding objects as conceptions of objects. This also turns Sartre's relation between material being in itself and conscious being for itself into a phenomenological relation between cognition and value or value states. And this also turns around Sartre's question, can one live this new freedom or aspect of being? Yet we are already in this condition of what Sartre calls a new aspect of being to some extent. It is the condition of our everyday relations between value and cognition. That is, in acts of moral fortitude, maturity, or inauthenticity, self-deception, and weakness of will. We have now presented other people, objects, and principles in terms of conceptions or cognitive frameworks. The principle that we call truth is thought to be of intrinsic value, yet it is incommensurate with other people. That is, the concept of truth and the existence of other people are different kinds of things, so how can we relate them? So I now want to present truth as a mode of cognition, like but different to belief and knowledge. This will make truth both accessible and scalable with the value of other people. Nietzsche first took this step by asking about the value of truth. Yet we can start by asking about the objectivity or subjectivity of truth. In fairness, we need to note that there is disagreement over truth as subjective or as absolutely objective. This subjective-objective distinction is also described as one between nominalism and realism. Yet modern philosophical thinking largely favours the subjective nominalist view. In support of this view, we can distinguish different theories and different applications of truth. Different applications of different kinds of truth are logic and mathematics, science, art, and moral values. And there are different theories of truth, such as correspondence, coherence, pragmatic, and redundancy theories of truth. These differences indicate that truth isn't a presuppositional absolute, but a value-laden human artifact. And choosing any one theory of truth requires different judgments or some unnamed theory. Kant also defined truth as not a constitutive but a regulative concept that guides rather than determines. Then Karl Popper defined truth as a regulative idea, as it is unknowable, yet offers criteria of falsehood. Paniel Rees-Cardenas finds truth also as a regulative principle in the works of both Hegel and Kierkegaard. And the idea of truth as an attitude supports the earlier idea of a will to truth taken up shortly. John McDowell, Thomas Nagel and Bernard Williams criticized the idea of an absolute conception of the world. Nagel recognized the significance of both subjectivity and the human capacity to take an objective view. But the objective view is continually stepping back into a disappearing view from nowhere that doesn't exist. The outcome of this thinking is again that truth isn't presuppositional or absolutely objective. There is no final theory of truth nor a definitive conception of any truth. Yet this also means that truth isn't a cognitive state like belief or knowledge. That is, I can believe or know something or will truth, but I can't truth something. This is because, like blue, the colour blue, truth is a property or predicate of cognition. And as noted above, truth is indefinable and incomplete in character. The idea of the will to truth as an incomplete property increases the scope of supporting cognitive frameworks. In this case, the will to truth is a precondition of the kind of value that wills truth and thereby attains value. Moreover, in this way, the will to truth can be compared to a moral goodwill. To explain, one aspect of More's naturalistic fallacy was that the moral good cannot be adequately defined. That is, because it was an irreducible and shouldn't be confused with natural properties like pleasant. John McDowell had a similar view about the uncodifiability of action in Aristotle's virtue theory. I disagree with More that we can't define the character of the moral good, which I do define in terms of value. But I agree that we can't definitively define any particular moral good or the highest moral good. This is because they are always liable to reformulation and further discovery. This leads to a comparison of the lack of a final conception of truth and no final conception of the good. The indefinability of both truth and moral values binds them together in an interesting kind of relation. That is, this comparison of truth and morality leads to evoking similar kinds of value. That is, because the character of value is largely determined by its objects, which are similar kinds in the base of both the moral good and truth. Leaving out a discussion about intent, what we have here is a symmetry between the will to truth and the good will. Both their objects are ultimately undefinable, and both claim ultimate obligations upon the individual. But there is something even more significant here than this symmetry. It is the systematic incompleteness of truth and the moral good as a property of cognition. I now want to describe the incompleteness of truth and ethics in terms of what I call attenuated cognition. That is, cognition is found in not only many complex kinds, but also in degrees. For example, it's often asked in religious and other contexts, how strongly one believes, or with respect to knowledge, it is asked how deeply one knows something. We can also note different ways of describing attenuated cognition, such as attenuated reference, singular reference, limited contrast, or context or background of understanding. I now want to discuss three applications of attenuated or graduated cognition as cognitive frameworks. One, as a graduated cognitive framework used as a moral criterion in different degrees of support. Two, as a graduated cognitive framework that helps to explain the mysteriousness of consciousness. And three, as a graduated cognitive framework that explains the obfuscation and neglect of consciousness. Firstly, moral fortitude has an independence from cognitive frameworks, that is, an unwarranted support that isn't desirable. Moral fortitude can be described as doing the right thing without social or cognitive support. I describe this as attenuated cognition in its degrees of cognitive support or its absence. This is a different way of looking at moral judgments than in traditional criteria. Examples of this kind of judgment can be found in Bernard Williams' notion of self-indulgence and in existentialism. Existentialists relish inadequately informed choices as occasions of freedom and inauthenticity. And Sartre's spirit of seriousness decries accepting values as objective, which thereby flee freedom. Secondly, attenuated cognition can also explain the characteristic mysteriousness of consciousness. Mysteriousness has been described by several thinkers. Freud describes mysticism as having a sense of oneness with the universe. Bertrand Russell described the mystical outlook as one of the interrelatedness of things. Wittgenstein talked about mysteriousness as feeling the world as a limited whole. Wittgenstein said that there are things that cannot be put into the world, they are what is mystical. This might be an exaggeration, but on another interpretation, they are mystical because they can't be described, rather than being a mystery that can't be described. Again, these are all examples of a particular kind of apprehension that of a limited context of understanding. Other mysterious objects with a limited context of understanding are objects like God, being, the universe, flying saucers, and the totality of things. An explanation is found in the kind of perception produced by limited context or background of understanding. Standard perception involves contrast and reference to a background of understanding. But self-consciousness cannot compare itself to other objects of the same type in the same way. Mysteriousness thereby exhibits a particular mode of attenuated cognition. Thirdly, mysteriousness can be further explained as an apprehension that involves a difficulty of self-understanding. That is, we are uniquely familiar with ourselves, yet our knowledge of ourselves is obscure. For example, I know that I exist, but who is known and who is the knower? The adage, know yourself, is hailed from the ancient Greeks to Sigmund Freud. To explain these examples, we can contrast the standard perception with the perception of self-consciousness. Standard perception involves contrast and reference to a background of understanding, like a black spot on a white board that can't be perceived as a white spot. But a limited context or background of understanding produces attenuated cognition. This arises because self-consciousness cannot compare itself to others of the same type in the same way. Self-consciousness experiences itself in a way that does not experience objects or other people. The pains and pleasures of other people are not the immediate pains and pleasures of oneself. And I recognize my own existence a priori, but I recognize objects a posteriori. So I repeat that self-consciousness cannot compare itself to other objects of the same type in the same way. So self-consciousness experiences an extreme form of attenuated cognition, and consciousness is mysterious because it experiences this kind of attenuated cognition. The significance of attenuated cognition as mysterious or self-obfuscation can be illustrated in another way. The contrast, context or background usually required by perception is denied to self-consciousness. Therefore, self-consciousness should not be able to exist. But it does exist, which is incredible. This incredible fact is another aspect of the uncanny nature of self-consciousness. My point is that this mysteriousness is a certain kind of perception that we have of consciousness, and that the mysteriousness and obfuscation are paradoxically ways of apprehending consciousness. This isn't the same as things being mysterious simply because we don't understand them. Moreover, for self-consciousness, background reference isn't just attenuation, but practically absent. This is a difficult idea that underlines some of the hidden difficulties of self-consciousness. So we are discussing cognitive frameworks primarily in their support of different qualities and priorities of value. One quality that has traditionally given priority to value is the concept of intrinsic value. So I want to use the idea of intrinsic value to lead us back to certain conceptions of things. Intrinsic values have been thought to have priority over attributed values almost by definition. But what are they? I previously argued that only mental states and conscious beings are candidates of intrinsic value, and that only positive value states that necessarily instantiate value are intrinsic values. Examples of such positive value states are love, self-esteem, courage, and magnanimity. But the ascription of intrinsic value does not resolve questions of priority or adequacy. This is because there are degrees of intrinsic value, and intrinsic value doesn't automatically mandate action. For example, I love my wife more than my dog, and respect for my neighbour doesn't mean that I must help him. So we still need criteria to determine the priority of intrinsic values. G.E. Moore and Robert Nozick determine both priority and intrinsic value with its degree of organic unity. Higher degrees of organic unity are held to herald higher value. This caters to graduation, but as Nozick points out, organic unity also applies to negative events. For example, in the case of concentration camps, hatred, evil plans, wars, and the concept of the devil. Yet this problem of negative events is due to convention and the objectification of value in material terms. As an internal property of thought, outside moral convention, organic unity still works as a criterion. For example, the unity of war plans or deliberated evil still produce value, albeit negative value. But this is another problem to be eliminated with judgments of positive intrinsic value. However, I think that organic unity can be more usefully described as coherence. As an example, I like the idea of God as a mythological example of organic unity or coherence. In this religious context, Satan represents the coherent but negative value. Philosophically, coherence of value could include features like consistency that I have explained elsewhere. Consistency here means reduction of psychological, ontological or theoretical gaps or fissures. For example, I'm thinking about constraints on value like Hume's principle and Sartre's bad faith. To derive an ought from an is involves an inconsistency that affects the quality of value. Consistency also excludes self-contradictory or self-negating values noted above. I find Sartre's constraints on value have even more influence on the quality of value. For example, if we are condemned to choose and condemned to be free, then the avoidance of choice and freedom is bad faith. And in the spirit of seriousness, subjective values are taken as objective to avoid freedom and responsibility. These examples show coherence and consistency as choosing values according to their inherent character. Yet, as in the problem of existential authenticity, internal characteristics aren't sufficient to determine value. In such cases, I look to the will to truth and the goodwill to provide normative direction. Yet coherence and consistency can even have consequences for values that have not been chosen for those reasons. For example, the is-ought distinction only applies to moral choices when that distinction is recognized. But coherence and consistency, or contradiction and negation, still affect values that aren't chosen. That is, synthesis of value, chosen or not, promotes higher qualities of value and experiences of meaning. This is, of course, a claim, but a claim that can be supported intuitively as well as in other ways. For example, to value what you really value, consciously or unconsciously, promotes meaning, and the principle to value, the value has a proclivity towards further substantive values. We could also refer to the positive principle of individuation, as Jung called it. In conclusion, we have returned to the point of value and the value of value as products of cognitive frameworks, and that both value and cognition are constituents of consciousness explained by theory of consciousness. That is, we started by illustrating a phenomenological and structural view with the metaphor of fluid in a container. This implied a dialectic between the development of value states and supporting cognitive frameworks. These were not only complex but also progressive and developmental. Cognitive frameworks considered were those of other people, religion, ethics, and even the qualification of truth. Yet we went further to consider how attenuated cognition led to morals, mysteriousness, and obfuscation. We then looked at coherence and consistency as both internal and external criteria of intrinsic value. External criteria found representation in certain cognitive frameworks, yet internal criteria also had effect in determining the quality of value, and that quality was given as a will to value, leading to a sufficiency of value. This is the last of Series 6, consisting of 10 workshops that attempt to present a philosophy of value. Both Series 5 and Series 6 were systematic in presenting the topics in an ordered way. This served my purposes, but was probably unrecognised by most participants. Next week I'll begin Series 7 as random topics of interest that are relevant to these workshops. So let me have your views and criticisms on websites such as here or meetup.com philosophy of value workshops. Thank you.